Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so good stuff today. Very impressed. All right, so we got the chance to talk about some like unknown facts about, well, not unknown, things that a lot of people know about the Islamic faith and the Muslim faith and things like that, and kind of them entering into their own little golden age era. And we kind of gave you a crash course on their religion in general, just so we can understand the group of people that are fighting against each other in these next oncoming wars that we're about to discuss. All right, so now we are now getting into a period of time known as the Crusades, which are insanely convoluted, motivated wildly differently by a lot of different reasons. But the basic things you need to understand are the motivations and the understandings of the first three, all right? Because the fourth and later Crusades are pretty insane, very wishy-washy, very like all over the place. There was like a Norwegian crusade, there was like Northern Crusades where like, you know, all these people in Germany were fighting against pagans in their own country and like like it's crazy, all right? So, but we need to understand the ones that are all about the Holy Land, right? So really quick, let's talk about launching them in general. So what the Crusades are, beginning in 1099, is a set of religious wars in order to regain or control the Holy Land known as Jerusalem, right? Now, the first crusade wasn't even really after Jerusalem, ironically enough, and several other areas, but we're going to get into all that wishy-washy stuff in general. But the main objective that you're talking about from the third and later crusades is to regain control of a very sacred site known as the Holy Land, which is the city of Jerusalem, right? This is going to occur mostly during the High Middle Ages and then cross over into the destructive period known as the Late Middle Ages that we're going to get into tomorrow, all right? And we're going to start talking about corruption in the Catholic Church, and we're going to start talking about the plague, and we're going to start talking about, what's the other thing? Oh, the 100 Years' War, right? Things like that, okay? So this whole thing, though, is all over this particular area of land, right? The city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a holy city for the major three faiths when it comes to the monotheistic faiths of the world, right? We're talking about Islam, we're talking about Judaism, we're talking about Christianity, right? Now, in this particular picture, you can see relics of two of them in particular. You can see the Dome of the Rock, which is a Islamic shrine that is built originally on top of an old Jewish temple that was destroyed when the Romans came in during the 70s BC. But then, ironically enough, this temple, or the Dome of the Rock, is actually built upon that site, and it was built around the 600s AD during the Muslim Golden Age, right? So, and then also right here you have the Wailing Wall, right? The Jewish holy site in which people make massive pilgrimages to, and they write small prayers on little slips of paper and then insert them into the walls because it's an old retaining wall of one of those major Jewish holy sites and temples that was actually destroyed during Roman invasions. I believe the Wailing Wall goes with one of the major churches under David, but I could be wrong. Wailing Wall. But there we go. The Wailing Wall, though, is another major site. And then Jerusalem's even home to the Jordan River, right, that passed through their holy land where Christ himself was baptized, right, in the baptismal font that you could actually go and visit today and also even have yourself rebaptized in, which is insane, right? So this one land, very important, right? Very big home to several different areas. The Western Wall of Catel, which is we'll look it up, though. And Old City of Jerusalem. All right, so now, anyway, really quick. So, what's going to end up happening in this entire situation? Okay, there's a couple things you need to edit out of this, like Flip, because it's like some of this stuff. I don't know what I was typing or what I was thinking, but it happens to the best of us. So, anyway, now what's going to end up happening is Muslims, particularly the Umayyad Muslims at the time, are going to be trying to take control of the Holy Land, right? And originally, they do. They actually come in and they usurp the area that Jerusalem is inside of, and they take it away from the Byzantines, right? Most of these people that are doing this are Umayyad Turks or Seljuk Turks, right? So the Turks who have recently committed or converted to Islam in the last like 400 years have been having a massive golden age period. They're making a ton of money off that monsoon marketplace. They're trading things. They're inventing different types of mathematics. They're growing at massive rates. And so they're going to take control of what was known as the old Persian Empire, right? And so in other areas like that. So they're going to go into Iraq and take that over. And they're going to consolidate the entire Middle Eastern area under one new faith and use that as the driving force to try and get out there and conquest different areas as well. Much like the Christians did in the early Middle Ages, right? So with this, though, as you can see right here, this is the Byzantine. And they're being heavily threatened by this massive Muslim force, right? Which leads to Pope Urban II, all right? So Urban II calling for the Council of Clermont. And at the Council of Clermont in France, he gives an emboldened speech where he says, we must go out, protect the Holy Land, and unite ourselves under a Christian bannerment, Deus Vult, which means God wills it, right? So he gives this massive, impassioned speech, and he launches the first Crusades, saying that crusading and Christian knights need to get out there and they need to go retake control of our most holy site, right? So he's going to call for these Christian warriors to go fight against the Turks. Now, this right here is a map. That is the Byzantine, and here's little Constantinople. These areas were actually being controlled by all the Muslim-like Turks, right? So that is where the original path. Now, this right here is the Council of Clermont, where Urban II calls the First Crusade, okay? So with that, though, this is what immediately comes to mind whenever you think crusading warriors. Not actually true, right? Whenever we're thinking about crusading knights, everybody always thinks of these guys, the Knights Templar, right? The Knights Templar were actually a faction created in the Second Crusade to try and protect pilgrims and people journeying to Jerusalem that were Christian from marauding Muslim armies and things like that, right? So the Knights Templar are one small faction of them. Most of your crusaders were actually poor people, right? They were just groups of people sent out. Now, ironically enough, you see where it says 2? That's supposed to say 4. All right, so 4 groups of people were originally sent out on this very, very, very first crusade, right? And they go out, and 2 of them are groups of peasants, and others were trained knights, and their main goal was to retake the Holy Land. And they actually do. They do it successfully, right? Even though, ironically enough, the first people to get there, speaking of crusading and whatnot, let's wait for morning prayer. All right, we're back. Sorry, I had to wait for the announcements to be over, be respectful during prayer and whatnot. But anyway, like we said, 4 groups of people got sent out, right? The first ones that showed up were a bunch of peasants and stuff, and they did a lot of bad stuff. All right, so the big problem with launching a crusade at any point is you don't want to send peasants, right? You send peasants. Peasants are motivated by wildly different things. Peasants are sometimes, like we talked about in class today, a little ignorant to other faiths and things like that. So they end up going to winning some of these early crusades, and they actually do establish 4 states that become strongholds. But as they go, a lot of these poor groups of these crusaders, they massacred a lot of towns of Jewish people and Muslims along the way, and this entire thing actually destroys a lot of relationships between Christians and the rest of the Islamic countries going forward, right? And also is another sign of that anti-Semitic attitude during the Middle Ages, right? So going forward, though, the big thing is these 4 states were the ones that are going to be established, right? So as you can see right here, one is called Edessa, the other one is Antioch, and the other one is going to be called the state of Jerusalem, right? So, and then, here you go, there you go. Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, right? So Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem. These are the 4 states that they established, right? Now, ironically enough, some of y'all are like, well, wait a minute. How come, the Byzantine didn't take these things back over? Well, the Byzantines kind of stopped supporting the Crusaders as they were getting into the Middle Eastern area known as the Holy Land, right? So a lot of these independent crusading states, these 4 groups were like, look, all right, I'll start a state here, you start a state there. And the idea of these things is just to be strongholds, right? Just an area to protect from future Muslim attack. But then the Second Crusade ends up getting launched when the Muslims actually take control of one of these states, Edessa, right? Edessa gets completely sieged during one of these things because it's very, very vulnerable to attack because it doesn't have any of the geographic borders that the other 3 states have, like being butted up against water or having an ally in Cyprus right nearby, right? So the thing about it, Edessa falls to the Muslim empires, and they launch a Second Crusade to go and help the other 3 states and to try and take Edessa back. But it's a massive failure, right? A huge failure. Because the Muslims actually come in and they destroy Edessa completely, okay? So the Second Crusade ends up being a massive failure. So when we're looking at the Crusades so far, the first one is pretty much a success, right? Urban II's goals are accomplished, right? And everything gets handled. But then the Second Crusade is a little bit on the rough side because, in like about 100 years later, they fail to protect one of their biggest areas. Now, anyway, but going forward, though, the Third Crusade then gets launched a little bit later. And a lot of this is fought between two key figures, right? So the Third Crusade is a massively important thing, all right? So right now the Christians are 1-1, right? The Second Crusade being a massive failure. Two key figures are going to end up going after the Jerusalem during the Crusade, right? So this period is very important because one of the figures that shows up is a man named Saladin, right? So Saladin actually has a much longer name, and in this longer name, he's the righteous defender of the faith, right? So Saladin actually is the Sultan of Egypt, right? Very, very prideful Muslim, an amazing general, and he's actually really friggin' smart, all right? So Saladin is as a young man was actually the nephew of the man that was able to revolt and take over all of Egypt, right? And he learned a lot from watching his uncle fight. But after his uncle passed away, he took control of his armies and took over Egypt completely, right? And then the caliphate died, and he becomes the Imam Sultan of Egypt, right? Now, the irony is in this whole thing that there was a rivalry that was created between Saladin and the Crusading Knights, because the Crusading Knights were some people actually called in and contracted in to help the man that he overthrew in Egypt. So he's got a very bad taste in his mouth whenever it comes to Crusading Knights. So what Saladin decides to do is he collectively gets an army together, and he goes out and he takes Jerusalem, right? So he goes out, takes Jerusalem. This calls for yet another what? A Third Crusade, all right? And I think it's in 1189. Yeah, 1189. In 1189, about 40 years later, Saladin takes Jerusalem, calling for yet another one. And what ends up happening, this is Saladin himself right there as he's taken over Jerusalem. This right here is King Richard the Lionheart, the most famous out of the Christian crusaders that goes to go and defend Jerusalem, right? Now, ironically enough, when we're talking about Christian folklore, right, this is what everybody imagines King Richard the Lionheart looking at. Like giant, intense defender of the faith. But in reality, he looked more like this, right? And ironically enough, he wasn't the best king on the planet, all right? He was only king for about 10 years, and he only spent 6 months of that 10-year reign in his own country because his biggest goal in life was to go out there and set up shop and defend the faith and go after the crusade, go after Jerusalem and take it back from Saladin and the marauding armies of the Muslims, right? The marauding armies of the Muslims. But the irony is, in this whole situation, that many nobles are going to answer the call, but none were as strong or as famous as Richard I, a.k.a. Richard the Lionheart, right? Ironically enough, the Lionheart thing was actually added on when a lot of his locals back in England were like, this guy's kind of a jerk, and everybody was like, no, he's the Lionheart. It was like a propaganda scheme, right? So he leaves to go and fight the crusade. Now, in this whole process, since he's only living back at his house for about 6 months, he actually never has any children, right? So he never fathers any children. Okay? He also was engaged at the age of 6 at one point, I think. But Richard the Lionheart shows up to try and attack Jerusalem. Unfortunately enough, though, they respect each other a lot as generals, right? And Richard is not the only crusader that goes. There's 2 other ones that go as well. One's named Frederick of Barbarossa, who unfortunately dies in a river because he tries to swim through it with armor on like an idiot. All right, and then the other one is a guy named Philip II of France. And Philip II and Richard hate each other with a fiery passion. So they refuse to get along, right? They actually end up going to war with one another a little bit later on. But Richard the Lionheart and Saladin respect each other a lot, right? And what ends up happening is Richard tries to invade Jerusalem multiple times. But there's a desert that separates Jerusalem and another city that he's living in. It's called Acre, or A-C-R-E. It looks like acre, basically. Now, where Richard has to go from here to Jerusalem every time, he ends up always running out of supplies, and he ends up being unable to take the city of Jerusalem. So what they end up doing, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart end up collectively getting together and agreeing to a peace, right? So he tries to go back to England, but Richard actually gets kidnapped on the way back to England, and he's held for ransom. All the while, his brother John is back in England, right? So King John of England, the guy that signed the Magna Carta, very nice. All right, so is back in England taking control, right? So Richard tries to go back. He gets kidnapped. They hold a huge ransom for him, right? But then what ends up happening is the family ends up paying the ransom eventually. He goes back. He is recrowned King of England, but then he dies in 1199, and King John gets to take over yet again anyway, right? King John ends up raising taxes on everybody because he goes to war with Richard the Lionheart's biggest rival, Philip II of France. He loses all the land in northern France. He ups taxes on everybody. The nobles start up taxing on everybody else. And guess what famous figure comes around during this whole time when King John is raising taxes on everybody right before the Magna Carta? There began to be this mythical figure known as Robin Hood, the Prince of Thieves, right? The famous archer that lived out in the woods in Sherwood Forest, and he stole from the rich to give to the poor because of the unfair taxes that were being levied by King John, right? So, that whole story is actually interrelated. And there's a good to solid chance that King John and, that Richard the Lionheart and Robin Hood never actually met each other. All right, so anyway, now, really quick. So, Fourth and later Crusades are going to be launched as well, and Crusaders are going to be attacking Constantinople, and this is going to lead to a massive lack of organization and strong leadership. So the Fourth Crusade's a failure. 5 more Crusades follow after the fourth one, but the Christians are never able to retake the Holy Land. So from the Third Crusade and on, the crusading knights of the Christian community completely lose out, and they do not ever retake the Holy Land ever again. Now, we have a story I have to tell you tomorrow. Just give me a little gap real quick and write down the Children's Crusade, all right? The Children's Crusade, and don't let me forget. And then skip 5 spaces in your notes and then go down, and we're going to talk about that story tomorrow. It's hilarious. All right, so now, the effects of the Crusades are actually super intense. Now, the economic changes are going to be huge. Trade and trade goods are going to increase after the Crusades, and much more items are going to start moving throughout Europe, even though a lot of war and death and destruction ended up happening, and Jerusalem gets sacked twice, and then, Constantinople ends up being completely destroyed and left very, very weak. But political changes are also going to come about. A lot of lords are never going to return home. This actually allows a lot of these kings to take that land and give themselves more power. A lot of social changes end up popping up when Christians are going to start seeing Jews and Muslims as enemies, leading to a lot of rifts between the faiths. And then Muslims are going to see Christians as invaders. Again, we're leading to a lot of rifts between the faiths. You could theoretically say that we are still feeling the reverberations of the Crusades over almost 1,000 years later, right? So, which is absolutely insane. But also, the big thing about it as well is the Crusades had a lot of odd things that went along with it as well. So before the Crusade, church power had reached its absolute height, right? So in the 1080, All right, there you go. In the 1080s, under Pope Gregory VII, before the very first Crusade was ever even launched, Henry IV and Gregory VII are these two guys that hated each other with a fiery passion, because it all had to do with this thing called the investiture crisis, where the kings of these countries wanted to pick their bishops and their cardinals on their own, and the Pope was like, no, you're taking some of my power away from me. And this led to a lot of those struggles between popes and kings. Since nobles are constantly fighting over land with their kings, Urban II probably just wanted to unite Europe against a common enemy, right? So since there was all this infighting inside of Europe between popes and kings and guys having to wear shirts made out of hair, which is a whole other thing that if you want to ask me about, be like, what's up with this hair shirt? And I'll explain it to you tomorrow. There's a lot of infighting in Europe. So they decide, Pope Urban II might have just been trying to unite them against a common enemy. Also, Pope Urban II never even claimed that the First Crusades were even crusades or a holy war at all. He actually apparently sent the Crusaders on a pilgrimage, hoping that the Islamic people would attack, causing a war, right? So possibly leading to them wanting to regain the Holy Land. And then the last one is, most of your Crusaders were nobles who were just leading bands of poor people. Very few of them were even really knights in the long run. So the Crusaders are a big mishmash of chaos, all right? But that's it. We're going to end the flip right here. That's just kind of a crash course in the Crusades. It's something we try to go over very quickly, because if I get into it, it's going to get real long and drawn out, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and leave you here. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Y'all have a good one.